And welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Oh, Keith, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. You had a big week, didn't you?
Oh, hey,
Why
we
don't
had
before we
a
get into our guests, let's talk about what all happened this week.
we did. We had Alan Carr and two other folks, Bree Steves and Julie, his boss, actually was here with him, and then we had Dick Groves, the grandson of General Groves, to come into town as well. So we spent a good bit of time out at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We had a panel discussion out there that was very well received. There were about 150 people in the audience and another 250 online. So it was a good opportunity to talk about the Manhattan Project history. We also had Alan to talk at the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association's monthly meeting, and we've got that recorded, so it'll be available on YouTube as well. And it was just, and of course, went to Y12, and Alan talked for them out there as well. And they were, I have to admit that I'm glad to admit that the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and Y12 both just really did a good job in helping Dick Groves. Dick is doing a documentary, 13 one-hour segments that he's producing to go on television. And his focus is on the early part of the Manhattan Project, which is not something that we've had a lot of attention to. And it was good to get him to look down on Y12. And he was talking about the time when his grandfather said, we're going to double the size of Y12. And he wanted to know which buildings to include in the second half. And we were able to let him draw that on a map and actually looking down on Y12 from up on Chestnut Ridge. So it's been a rich week for me to be a part of bringing those folks in and getting them involved and engaged in learning about the details in Oak Ridge. So it has been a good week.
Well, good. Well, let's just go ahead and get started, and you can introduce our guest today.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we've got Danny Thomas on here with us. Danny and I have known each other for a good while electronically. We've not met, but his book, Elza Gate, is one that I really think is an excellent novel, one that I've enjoyed. And he's now preparing a second book that will be coming out soon. And we want to let him talk about his writing experience. He's brought a couple of people with him today. Deb Hotchkiss, I know Deb. I mean, she's an Oak Ridger, and so is Bonnie Albright, shoemaker, but are close to Oak Ridge. But I know Deb from her photographs more than any other aspect, and she's an excellent photographer. But I'm glad to know that these two ladies are helping Danny with his book, and we're glad to have them on here with us today. So, Danny, tell us about your book and what you're doing, all right?
All right. I have a grand plan, at least I hope it's grand, to have a trilogy. Elza Gate being book number one. Book that's being finished up right now is called Solway Gate. And then the third one, which is in the future, would be White Wing Gate.
Oh, my.
And
so you're covering 3 of the 7 gates that were there during the Manhattan Project and actually up until 1949. The 3 you've got, Elza, Solway, and White Wing, would be what I would say are on the southern entrances to the Oak Ridge at the time. So, well, Elza's actually on the east entrance, but Solway's on the southern, and then White Wing is one that most people probably don't know much about. It's down on Highway 95, I think, and it's down on the south and to the west. So that kind of helps set the stage for where those gates were. Okay.
Right. I appreciate you laying it out like that. My writing has always been about things that I'm familiar with, things that I know, and I've spent time in my lifetime, certainly in East Tennessee, some in Alabama when I went to the university, and most of my experience here in North Carolina. I currently live in Winston-Salem. But Elza Gate is where I began the historical fiction based on true life figures and people and events. But a lot of it is just letting my imagination run wild. And when I do that, I sometimes make mistakes. And so I check with Debbie and with Bonnie to say, does this sound right to you? So I want to stop at this particular point and turn to Deb and Bonnie to let them give their brief perspective about how they've helped me and why they've helped me. So Deb, would you start?
Sure. As Danny said, we've known each other since we were about 3 or 4 years old. And also his dad was my pediatrician and one of my favorite people up until the time Dr. Thomas passed away a few years ago. But as we were growing up, we lived in between Oak Ridge and Clinton on Highway 61, where my dad, who's Dr. James C. Kyle, had moved first to veterinary practice and then a mouse business, raising mice for research. So my family, I won't go into that now. I'll just say, so when Danny and I were talking about things with the book, he might check with me about some of the facts about Oak Ridge or whether the information sounded right for people who lived in the area where I grew up, which is where Bonnie still is, in the Dawson area. But also I went to school and a lot of my classmates were in Oak Ridge. So it was kind of two places that I grew up, both in the Dawson Clinton area and also in Oak Ridge.
Bonnie, you want to add to that?
Well, I grew up in the same stomping grounds. Danny and I were actually neighbors, and Deb too, although I didn't know Deb that well since she went to Oak Ridge. But I'm helping out too because I had 34 years at K-25, so I kind of have a perspective on what's going on.
She helps me with basic facts. Like at one point I mentioned in the foreword to my book that she had spent 35 years at Y12, and she said, no, it's K-25. So little things like that she picks up on. Let me read something from the introduction to Elza Gate that I think will sort of put it all in perspective about sort of a summary of what we're about.
Okay.
Elza Gate was where rural citizens of Anderson County first encountered military and elite scientific personnel assigned by the Army Corps of Engineers to undertake an unprecedented experiment, the development of the world's first nuclear weapon. Few, however, were familiar with the nature of the weapon at that time, yet all were undoubtedly aware of drastic transformations surrounding them, challenging their customs and traditions, and pulling them inexorably toward a formidable new existence. And that's essentially my focus on this trilogy is you've got an encounter, a series of encounters for years after years of rural country folk who are encountering scientific and military personnel from all over the world. And they're bringing secrets. And the secrets bother people. Some people feel pressure to keep the secret. Others are just intensely curious to find out what the secret is. And knowing the people of Anderson County the way I knew them when I grew up was the essence of the story.
Well, I think that's a good basis for a trilogy, and I'm anxious to see what you do with the. I've read your Solway Gate, and I think it's going to be great. And of course, I have the Elza Gate, so I'm anxious to see you continuing the stories. Tell us a little about some of the characters that you put in and why you put them in there. Well,
one of the main characters who tends to pop up now and again in all the books that I have written is a fellow named Jeter Buckley, and he is a scoundrel of the first water. He is intensely curious to find out what the thingamajig, what the gadget is, and won't stop pestering people to try to find out what's going on. He just cannot stand the idea of a secret. And I believe that is the essence of how a lot of people in Anderson County felt and still feel about what went on during the Manhattan Project.
Danny, let me ask you a question. Is there a certain character or family that Elza Gate revolves around?
Well, there's a series of them. Buckley is an individual. He's not a family. Then there is the Woodson family, and Woodson's may be a name that you and Ray would remember because there used to be Woodson's grocery store right outside of Elza Gate. In addition to that, there is a Lieutenant Robert Blankenship, and Blankenship is the name I took from the Oak Ridge football field, where I was played some for Clinton High School, and whenever we went to Blankenship Field in Oak Ridge, we got wiped out. Anyway, I've got these characters that tend to pop up again and again as the story is intertwining. And it may be that Deb and/or Bonnie could add to that perspective as to what they think is a recurring theme. So girls, what do you think?
Well, I might bring up Ida Rose D-Lab.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, because she is a character that's maybe sort of modeled after what I told you was an old bootlegger on Old Bentley Road. And she's a country woman who heals people with herbs and natural stuff. And she's quite a character, quite a tough character. So.
She's one of my favorites as well in your stories, Danny. One of the other things that interests me so much is that you do such a great job with hearing the language of people in our area and juxtaposing that with the military and scientists who've come from all over the United States, who obviously have a completely different language. And as a matter of fact, speaking to that, your dad called me Dobby my entire life because apparently I sounded like my mom, who's from upstate New York, when I was a toddler. And so he continued to call me Dobby.
I remember that. I was going to mention it, but I didn't want to embarrass me or you.
I'll just do that for us.
I'm glad you brought up my father, because I have noticed as I'm getting ready for this session that a lot of what I put into Elza Gate and what's gone into Solway Gate and probably will go into White Wing Gate has to do with medicine and medical issues and illnesses and injuries. And of course, you write what you know. And I remember listening to conversations between my mother and father. My mother was a nurse, father a pediatrician. And a lot of what they talked about day in and day out was things that were happening at the hospital or when he went on house calls. And so that obviously has affected me, because in Solway Gate, there are 3 stories, 3 long chapters that involve medical issues or medical problems. And I think that that's one of the legacies of the Manhattan Project, is the lingering problems with radioactivity and with cancer and with other issues that could not have been foreseen because the world didn't understand atomic energy and may not still understand it as well as it should. So that, as I've looked back over the stories, I didn't know it at the time, but I know now there's a lot of well-being and industry related to making sure that people can recuperate from damages that occur to them, whether they're man-made damages or natural occurrences.
Danny, what is this something that you always wanted to do, or is this just something that kind of came to you?
I have always wanted to write. I wrote a story when I was a sophomore in high school. My teacher just praised me so much. I said, well, maybe I could write another story and another and another. And that's the essence of what these books are, is little snapshots of taking this character and having him or her run into a problem that brings up another character. And I just follow them intermittently, but through history, realizing that you've got the juxtaposition of good and evil. You've got the juxtaposition of science versus home remedies. And that has been, I just bounce back and forth between those and let my imagination run wild with all the wonderful details that are now available about the Manhattan Project.
The I guess one of the questions, as far as the writing goes, I would imagine that it is fiction, but it's based on real fact. It's based on real people, real places, things such as that. So I would imagine that you're probably kind of I don't know, maybe limited a little bit, and to be able to make sure that the stories that you were telling were historically accurate, even though it was fiction. How did you deal with that?
Well, that's why I get back in touch with people like Ray and Deb and Bonnie to make sure that this sounds like it really came out of Oak Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like Anderson County. And then there is the encounter between the scientific, the military, and the rural country folk. Mm-hmm. And if it sounds right, and Deb's praised me for that here today, if it sounds right, I think that it's going to be right. And I continue to read a lot of different books and view podcasts and videos and DVDs to make sure that what I'm contemplating is plausible.
Right, right.
And I'll add that the fact that it's historical fiction gives you a good deal of freedom. But when you mention a place that is historical, then you need to be able to put it in perspective that doesn't go against the actual facts of the history. But the stories themselves are fictional. But it's interesting to note that in many cases they got their origin from, or your first recognition of the potential came from real life individuals.
Right.
And I think that's a unique perspective that's good to note.
Well, and Keith mentioned that it limits you in a way. In a way, I suppose it does, because it focuses on a time and a place in history. That's a limit. But there were so many people who came into Oak Ridge and who were escorted out of Oak Ridge that there is literally an unending possibility of a cast of characters for me.
Sure.
And some of them were based on people that I knew as I was growing up. And some of them are totally fantastic and not based on real life. But the more I work with them, the more lifelike they become.
So if you thought about the comparison between the country folks and the scientists and people just coming from other parts, just like Deb said, the accent sometimes would cause you to be identified as from a certain location. Do you play on that a lot? The accents, the different way that the people talk?
Somewhat of a degree. I try to make sure that it's not so colloquial that it would not be understandable by a typical reader.
Right.
There are a couple of situations that have come up as I've done my research to find out problems that came out of radioactivity and the huge magnets that were involved in some of the processes that could literally pull hairpins out of a lady's hairdo, and other things that are even more fantastic and more dangerous than that. One of the things that I have learned is about a community called Happy Valley.
Yes.
Happy Valley no longer exists, but it was a thriving part of the Manhattan Project for several years, and it was a little bit out of control. There were too many people having a good time looking for beer and hard stuff, and that was a sort of an interesting integration of desires from the military side and people who do their own generating of hard liquor in the East Tennessee hills. Put those two together and you've got a lot of possibilities. And I just followed my heart on what would make the most sense to portray and to give some real historical background to what was going on at the time.
Well, and as Ray well knows, Happy Valley basically was a construction town. It was where when they were building K-25, I mean, it was across the street basically from K-25 or just up from it. And that's where a lot of the construction workers work. So that may have a tendency to be a little rougher, than the people, down the road and, at X10 or
It was like the Wild Wild West.
It was, and what was it, Ray? About 15,000 people lived in Happy Valley at the time.
Yeah, 15,000 people there. They had their own theater, their own cafeterias, their own stores, dormitories, and lots of hutments that they were in. And of course, that's where the story about Katie Strickland's biscuit pan comes into play, where she had her husband. They were in separate parts of the hutments, and there was a fence around the women. And she had her husband bring her a piece of metal out. She made it into a biscuit pan, baked biscuits, and gave them to the guards. That way, he would let her husband stay longer with her if he was getting biscuits from Katie. Now that whole area of Happy Valley is one that's not been explored as much as the main part of the city of Oak Ridge. But you're right, there was a wild aspect to it, if you want to think about it that way. And the fact that this was located in a dry county situation didn't prevent them from being able to get a hold of alcohol and bring it in. And I'm just dying to know more about that real live bootlegger that you've introduced in, and that people know about that we haven't told much about, but you base one of your characters on it. And
yes, that lady happened to be, and I named her Isabel Disney.
Okay.
And Isabel was an older lady who was running liquor past the gates in such a way that she was never discovered until the very end.
Oh my goodness, how about that?
So again, Keith, let my imagination run wild. I never knew an Isabel or a Disney to be involved in that sort of thing. But I said, well, what if she was able to outsmart the gate guards and get it past them every day?
Oh, sure.
And that gave me what I thought was a pretty colorful chapter.
Yeah. Well, I guess probably one of the most famous stories is the taxi cab service that you would call, and they would come to your house and not take you anywhere. They just open the trunk and you buy your bottle of liquor out of the back of the taxi cab. That apparently went on for years and years. So,
well, Deb made a comment about one of the chapters that I asked her to read involving a Sergeant Marcus Brummett, who was the driver for General Groves. But as you know, General Groves was not always in town. He'd be in town for a while, and then he'd go to New York or Washington or out west, whatever he wanted to do. And so I decided to follow Marcus when the general was not in town. And he would do a little taxi service, driving people to Lenore City or to Harriman or to Clinton to go to some of the speakeasies that were available at that time.
Sure, absolutely.
It's fiction, but it's awfully close to the reality. I'm sure that had to go on, and that's great. Well, tell us about the book that's coming up now, the one you almost got ready. Bring us some characters out of Solway Gate.
Well, one is that Sergeant Marcus Brummett that I mentioned. Okay. Another one is a Black female maid working in the hospital, a female named Helen Jones. Now, when I was in college during the summers, would get some odd jobs. I worked construction. I worked at the hospital itself as a painter. And there was a Helen Jones who was a maid there at the hospital. And I sort of made up what I thought her background might be and what she might have become as a result of working, because the jobs in the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge were a tremendous magnet all around the South. people come for a long way to get a job and make better money than they could make at home.
Mhm.
And with that in mind, there was also a lot of turnover because of the things that needed to be controlled were hard to control. There was a lot of sexual infractions that occurred, and the STD rate was higher than it should have been, especially in the place they called the bullpen. And so again, I keep referring to it in a medical sense because that's the background that I had with my parents. They would be talking about things that they knew were going on that obviously you don't go see the doctor if you're feeling fine. You go to see the doctor when you got a problem. Yeah. And so there were some new problems that developed during the early years of the Manhattan Project, and it had an effect on the workforce. That's what I'm hoping will be part of the focus on the White Wing Gate book, is what happened after 1945 and maybe as late as 1970, because there were things discovered about exposures to radiation that created problems that people had no way of knowing in the 40s and weren't really aware of much in the 70s. Bonnie, have I left anything out? This is the question I usually ask several times when I'm doing my writing. Bonnie, what did I leave out?
Well, I don't think so, but I think that's a good point that you're going to do White Wing Gate and talk about the long-term effects, because as you said, during the project, people weren't aware of the hazards, health hazards. And so I'm glad you're doing that.
I'll need some help.
Okay. I'm curious about the STD. I don't know about that, so
I'll help you understand.
Enlighten me. Yeah.
And I wanted to include a chapter on Deb's father, Dr. Jim Kyle. Deb, you want to pick up on about our conversation about him?
Sure, I'll do a little bit. I just so the first one of my family that was here was my aunt Gladys Spengler. She came in 1942 with as a secretary to one of the first 3 or 4 people that came down from Manhattan. I assume with Union Carbide. I know she was based in Manhattan, and she was actually here for 2 or 3 years and then went back to Manhattan for another 10 or 11 years. She convinced my mom, who had just graduated from the School of Dental Hygiene in Rochester, New York, to come down because they needed dental hygienists. So my mom came in 1943 as a dental hygienist. And of course, they were all at the hospital, as all the medical and dental people were at that time. My dad was sent here with the Army in 1944. He had just graduated from Ohio State University as a veterinarian. And so he was first here as a veterinarian. And the first few years, there were a lot of different things going on for him. At first, he ran a veterinary practice as a concessionaire. That was very short-lived because he was actually the second veterinarian here. There was a Colonel Lloyd Jameson here for a little while in 1943. And then my dad was here in 1944, but in 1945, well, actually, I think Jameson was here in 44. In 45, Colonel Jameson left. And so my dad closed his practice and became the Oak Ridge veterinarian. So he was in charge of a lot of different things then. He was in charge of the horses that patrolled the city, and he actually patrolled the city. I have a photo of him with Major Bernstein. They're both on horses patrolling the city. Then, of course, he vaccinated the domestic animals that were here. He looked after the horses because there were several of those that were involved in patrolling the city. And he also did meat inspection. So that was early on. And then, of course, Colonel Stewart bought 75 cattle from Los Alamos in December of 45. They were about 30 miles from the Trinity test, and so they had been radiated. So my dad went out and signed for those cattle, and 58 of them were sent to Oak Ridge right away, and the other 17 were still in Los Alamos. And then sometime later, the 17 that had been left in Los Alamos and 7 calves were also sent to Oak Ridge. So for the first few years, that was underneath Roan Anderson, and my dad had a lot to to do with looking after them, testing them periodically with blood draws to see what the effects of radiation had been, and things like that. There obviously were beta burns, so they were polled Herefords. So the reddish brown hair had turned gray or white and continued to be that way for a long time. And then around the same time, he also started working as a biologist at ORNL. And there, of course, they were interested in radiation genetics and recovery. And so those were the few areas that he began. And of course, it went from there, but that's enough for now.
Well, what Deb has mentioned has reminded me about a chapter in the book Solway Gate about a fellow named Eb Cade, who really was a fellow who worked in Oak Ridge named Eb Cade, who got injured, and the hospital, the doctors there decided to inject him with radioactive material just to see how he handled it. And that was a real life dilemma, a moral dilemma that of course has been identified and dealt with since then. But it's the kind of incident, Keith, that lets my imagination take it and run with it.
Sure, absolutely.
That is a real event that happened and has been recorded and reported.
I don't want people to think that exactly what I wrote down is exactly the way it happened, but I do want them to read it.
Yeah, I understand, and I appreciate that.
Sure.
The story in itself is interesting, but I'm sure in a fictionalized version, you can add some additional things to it that will be of interest. Deb, I have to say that I've been intrigued by what you said about your father, and I wonder, have you written that down?
I've written parts of it down. And Ray, one of the first times I met you was out at Friels Bend several years ago, and Mick Wiest was telling you about my dad. Right. And we talked about following up, and then I never did that. And I think recently you actually met my brother.
I did.
I think Charlie Hensley introduced the two of you at the service for Shigeko. So maybe Dorn and I need to get together and write some things down.
You really do. And I will encourage you to let me publish it in Historically Speaking. So when you're ready, we can do a series on it, and then you can make it into a book if you like. But the first place that I'd like to do it is to put it in Historically Speaking.
Okay, Ray, I appreciate that. I'll follow
Ray,
through this time.
Ray, you're going to have to compete with me. I've already interviewed her for about an hour.
That's okay. It's okay if it comes out in two places. Mine will not be fiction unless I make a mistake.
On that note, let me add a little interesting historical thing. Where Dr. Kyle's farm was for years in his veterinary practice and in their home and everything was originally part of the house I live in that was built in around 1850. And that Aunt Hannah sold the land to Dr. Kyle when he came to Oak Ridge because she didn't want to pay taxes on it. Yeah.
Yep,
So
that's where he opened
in the next book,
where are your books available? I mean, where's Elza Gate and your new one? How can people get them?
I'm glad you brought that up. I have had them listed at Jefferson Compounding and at the American Museum of Science and Energy. And I believe that Elza Gate is also available on Amazon.
Okay.
And it's also out at the K25 History Center. I saw it out there yesterday.
Yeah, I was going to add that as well, Ray.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
All right. Is there anything more that you'd like to add about either your existing book or what's coming out?
Well, I wanted to thank Bonnie and Deb for assisting me here and helping to fill in the gaps. This is what I ask them to do when I send them a manuscript, saying, what did I leave out? What needs to be corrected? And they usually can wield the red ink pen real well to mark through my mistakes. And I appreciate them being willing to do it on this video.
I do too. I appreciate you all for coming on and helping with this discussion about Danny's books. And so delighted that you're continuing to work on the trilogy. I think that's going to be a good series to have out there for folks to read and enjoy.
And
It
it's
keeps me occupied and out of trouble for the most part.
and it's always a great thing to have other people, those of us sometimes that write or make documentaries or whatever, sometimes it's a kind of a lonely existence. Sometimes we work by ourselves a lot, and to have other eyes on what you've done is not only helpful, but it also helps you catch mistakes that you've made. So
It makes for a better result.
it does. Absolutely.
And I'm
Well-
very grateful to these ladies.
And Danny, we're grateful to be able to do that. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that I can remember when Danny was, I think, probably in high school, and he was talking about what a great storyteller his mom was, and wanted to get down a lot of her stories because she was such a great storyteller. And so a few of the chapters have to do with his mom and her time when she was a nurse. And then recently one is also about his sister and his mom. And so it's fun for me in an additional way, just knowing them as I was growing up and seeing them included, not with their real names, but with enough that I know exactly who they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, folks, thank you all so much for being with us today. We really, really appreciate it. And let everybody encourage folks to get a copy of Elza Gate and read it.
Absolutely.
you.
You'll find it a good book. And as I mentioned, it's available in the museums, at least two of the museums in Oak Ridge, and on Amazon. So you can get a copy of it. And when do you think you're going to have the Solway Gate out?
Well, Bonnie has got to help me with her.
I'm working on it.
First.
I've
And
got
once
them done. I just got to send them.
Once that's done, I'm hoping it'll be either late 2023 or early 2024.
Okay, very, very good.
Very good.
And Deb, I'll not put a deadline on you, but the sooner the better, okay? When you can.
All right, right. Yep. And Ray, have a great time next week
Oh, thank you.
with
Thank
your
you.
visits.
I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to that trip to Iceland. It's going to be a good one. I'm hoping to see the Northern Lights.
I hope you do as well.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you,
And Ray,
gentlemen. We appreciate it.
sure. And Ray, you're going to be gone, but we'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks with a new one, won't we?
Yes, we will. And we've got Bob Davis scheduled to come up later this month. He's a freelance writer for the Wall Street Journal.
Mhm.
And he's written about Oak Ridge, and I think it'll be a good conversation with him. And I've also had conversation, Alan Carr, the historian from Los Alamos National Lab, was in town last week. And he's one of the folks that we've had on here before that have been really well received. And he indicated the desire to come on again. And I know he's wanting to talk about the Oppenheimer movie. So it'll be good if we can get him on and do that. Now, Danny, have you seen that movie, Oppenheimer?
Have not seen it yet. I did see Barbie, though. I wanted to let you know. I did see Barbie. I'm going to see Oppenheimer for sure.
Barbenheimer.
Okay. Well, Keith, I can't leave that thought without saying that I went to see the Oppenheimer movie at the IMAX theater up in Opry Mills in Nashville. The first ticket I bought online, I made a mistake and didn't get the IMAX. So after I watched it there and I came out and my best Southern accent, I asked the guest services to help me. And she did. She got me a ticket into the IMAX. And then I said, okay, now get me Barbie. And she got me Barbie that night. So I watched Oppenheimer for 3 hours, had a hamburger, and watched Barbie then in the evening. Now, don't you know they made fun of a 77-year-old gray-haired man sitting in the middle of a bunch of 20-year-old women?
That's all right. Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with
that at all. As a matter of fact, this last week was a homecoming at the high school where I teach. And of course, they have a dress up day every day. You dress up as something different. And the first day was Barbenheimer. So it was either Barbie or Oppenheimer. So we had a lot of Barbies. We didn't have very many. A few Oppenheimers, but not many. So
man. Well, I hope you had a pork pie hat that you could wear.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. All right, folks. Well, thank you all so much again for joining us this morning. And folks, so we'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks with another episode of Hidden History.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You.